The desert wind carried dust across her face as the truck came to a halt. She was 23, a former Japanese nurse, and she had been told to expect degradation. The guards would mock her. The Americans would spit, maybe strike. They might strip her down, parade her like an animal. That was what they said in Manila before surrender. "They'll humiliate us." Her hands shook as she stepped down. But then she saw it. Cowboys, real ones, wide-brimmed hats, dusty boots, spurs that jingled. Not soldiers, not interrogators. Cowboys. One tipped his hat, and another handed her a tray. A tin plate, heavy and warm. Smoke curled into the air. Barbecue. Pork, slow-cooked, dripping with sauce, served beside cornbread and beans. Her stomach clenched, not in fear, but confusion. Was this mockery? A trap? She hadn't smelled meat like this in years. One cowboy smiled, offered a piece. "Ain't much, but it's good." And that's when she realized the war inside her had only just begun. She blinked into the dust. The wind swept low across the plain, dry and warm, carrying the scent of hay, smoke, and something sweet, something impossible. Around her, the other women clutched their satchels tighter, unsure whether to follow the man in the cowboy hat who motioned toward the buildings ahead. It wasn't a camp like they imagined. There were no shouting guards, no snarling dogs, just wide skies, slanted wooden fences, and a rhythm to the place that felt unnerving in its quietness. A horse neighed in the distance. A windmill turned with a tired squeak. It felt like stepping not into a prison, but into a painting. And yet, for all its calm, it filled her with dread. This wasn't what they had been told. That made it worse. In the weeks before their surrender on a jungle island, they had been warned. "If the Americans don't shoot you on sight," one officer had said, "they'll strip you, parade you through their towns, use you." He hadn't needed to say more. Everyone had heard the rumors. Everyone had read the leaflets dropped from planes. One nurse slit her own throat rather than be captured. Another walked into the ocean and never came back. To live through surrender was to walk into shame willingly. To board a transport ship bound for the enemy's land felt like a death that wouldn't end. They weren't soldiers anymore. They were symbols of failure, ghosts of an empire in collapse. And now they were here. The truck doors slammed behind them with a heavy finality. A few of the women jumped. The cowboy ahead didn't flinch. His spurs jingled faintly as he walked across the dry earth toward a squat building with a slanted roof. He didn't shout, he didn't sneer. Instead, he simply pointed toward a shaded area beside a tall pine and said something none of them understood. His tone was gentle, curious even. One of the younger women whispered, "This is the trick. They're pretending." Another just stared, wide-eyed at the strange figure before her. She had never seen a man wear a hat like that. His belt buckle gleamed in the sun. His boots were worn but clean. There was dust on his collar, a piece of hay clinging to his shirt. He looked more like a character from a children's storybook than a captor. That, somehow, made everything feel more dangerous. The ranch itself, if that's what it was, stretched out around them like a dream. There were no towers, no floodlights, just old wooden barracks set behind split-rail fences and a barn that smelled of animals and smoke. A group of men lounged near a fire pit in the distance, laughing softly among themselves. She saw a puff of smoke rise. Someone had lit something on a grill. The scent drifted toward them slowly, curling into their noses. It smelled like meat. Pork, maybe. Slow-cooked. Tangy. Spiced. It punched into her stomach like a fist. She hadn't tasted meat in weeks. Months, maybe. One of the women whispered, "Is that real?" Another looked away, ashamed that her mouth had begun to water. The surrealness of it all scraped at their nerves. Cowboys, barbecue, no screaming, no cages. It didn't make sense. One woman, a former signal operator, said aloud, "This is how they break us, with calm." She meant it as a warning, but the words were a comfort too. For now, they were not being broken. They were being watched, yes, herded maybe, but not humiliated. Not yet. The contradiction gnawed at them. Where were the punishments, the degradation? Where was the rage? She felt eyes on her and looked up. Another cowboy stood nearby, chewing something and watching the group with a neutral gaze. When their eyes met, he nodded once, not as a guard to a prisoner, but like a neighbor across a fence. She quickly looked down. Her stomach grumbled. The scent of food was stronger now, and it didn't smell like rations or boiled scraps. It smelled like home, though not hers. Not the salty rice or miso broth of Japan, but someone else's memory of comfort. As the women were motioned toward the barracks, the sky widened above them, endlessly blue and cloudless. There were no fences here they could see, and yet they were bound by something stronger than barbed wire. Suspicion, fear, and hunger. One woman said she couldn't tell what hurt more. She didn't know it yet, but the real prison wasn't made of walls. It was built from everything they had believed about America, about war, about dignity. And it was beginning to crack, because the smoke rising from the fire pit didn't carry pain. It carried promise. But promises were dangerous things. Promises could unravel everything they thought they knew. She stepped forward slowly, following the others across the packed dirt as the scent grew stronger, richer, almost intoxicating. It wrapped around them like warmth, but they shivered anyway. The sun had begun to lower, slanting amber light across the long grass, and at the edge of the open yard a row of tin trays waited. Steam curled up from the food. Her eyes locked onto it. Meat, ribs, thick, glistening slabs lacquered with a dark red sauce that shimmered in the light. Beside them were pale yellow squares she would later learn were cornbread, and a heap of something soft and smoky, baked beans. A pitcher of something cold sat nearby. And coffee, real coffee. She had not tasted anything like this in what felt like lifetimes. On the island, they'd boiled roots, stretched rice rations with bark. Once, she'd eaten her own bandage. It was that or nothing. Now, she stood before a plate heavy with food, and her hands didn't move. One by one, the women were handed trays by men who looked like they had stepped out of a Western postcard. One wore a red handkerchief around his neck. Another had a worn Stetson that cast a shadow over his sun-creased face. None of them smiled too wide. None looked angry. They just passed out trays like it was the most normal thing in the world. When it was her turn, she hesitated. The cowboy held out the plate, eyebrows raised. "You don't want it?" he asked. She didn't understand the words, but she heard no malice in them. Just a question. She reached out with trembling hands and took the tray. It was warm, heavy, her mouth filled with saliva, and her shame rose just as fast. What if it was poisoned? What if they were playing with them, feeding them like animals before the slaughter? Around her, the other women moved to the edge of the yard, finding spots in the sparse shade, some crouching, some sitting on crates. They didn't speak. They just stared at the food. One woman bit her lip so hard it bled. Another held her tray in her lap like a child holding a foreign object. She took a breath, then another, and raised a piece of rib to her lips. The sauce was sticky. Her fingers trembled. She bit. The taste hit her like thunder, sweet, sharp, rich. It coated her tongue, flooded her mouth, and broke something open inside her. Tears welled in her eyes before she could stop them. She bit again, faster, again, and suddenly she was weeping silently, chewing through grief. Across from her, another woman let out a sharp sob and buried her face in her sleeve. One nurse, older, dropped her fork and covered her mouth. "We shouldn't," she whispered. "We can't." But the body had already made its choice. A few feet away, the cowboy who had handed her the tray leaned against a post and drank from a chipped enamel mug. He didn't watch them like a guard. He watched them like someone trying to understand something too big to say. He scratched his beard, glanced at the fire, and called out something that sounded like, "Need more sauce soon." That was the moment that splintered her. Not the food, not the kindness, not even the tears. It was his voice. It was too casual, too human, as if she weren't his enemy, as if she were just a woman, hungry in the evening light. All around her, the women wrestled with the same storm. Some ate with shaking hands, eyes darting in case this was all just a test. Others tore pieces of bread and slipped them into their pockets, still convinced the generosity would vanish at dawn. One girl refused to eat, just sat holding the plate, staring into it like it might confess its true purpose. They had prepared for pain. They had practiced how to die with dignity. But they had never prepared for a meal this warm, this tender, this kind. And that, somehow, hurt the most, because it hadn't always hurt. Once it had burned, cleanly, purely. The shame of surrender wasn't confusion, it was certainty. She remembered the caves, the darkness, the sweat, the sickness, the way the air never moved and everything stank of rot and iodine. Her hands had bled from changing bandages on the dying. Her stomach had gnawed at itself. And still, they had clung to the only thing they had left, honor. Bushido had whispered through every corridor of the makeshift hospital, better to die, better to burn, better to disappear than be captured by Americans. They had made them recite it in training, like a prayer. Serve with loyalty, die with dignity. There were posters in the barracks, bright red slogans splashed over images of samurai warriors plunging blades into their bellies. She had memorized the lines. She believed them. Once, even as her patients wasted away under palm leaves, even as bombs fell and officers barked commands through gritted teeth, she held to that belief. Capture was not an option, but belief was fragile. Hunger, it turned out, was stronger. She had been treating a young boy, maybe 16, when the order came down. Destroy what you cannot carry. Burn the records. Prepare. The Americans were advancing. She saw it in her commanding officer's eyes. There would be no glorious last stand. He'd already packed a white cloth to wave. And then the chaos came. Shelling in the distance, shouts, a body slung over her shoulder as she ran through mud. No time for goodbyes. She remembered stumbling down a ravine with 3 other nurses. One had shrapnel in her calf. Another kept whispering her father's name over and over. They collapsed beneath a canopy of vines, clutching each other like broken dolls. And that's where the Americans found them, not with cruelty, but with silence. They didn't laugh, they didn't jeer, they didn't even speak much. One soldier offered water. Another pointed to the wound on her shoulder. She flinched, expecting the butt of a rifle. But instead he knelt and took out a bandage. She didn't understand. She didn't believe. Not yet. What she remembered most was the heat of her shame, how it pulsed through her skull when the medic lifted her sleeve gently and cleaned the blood without a word. She should have fought him, bitten, screamed, but she didn't. She was too tired, too afraid, and in some secret place, too grateful. Still, the warnings echoed. "The Americans will not spare you," the colonel had barked. "They do not see you as human. They will strip you, starve you, use you." She had believed him. They all had. Why else would the others take their own lives? Why else would a fellow nurse press a broken syringe into her neck rather than face the enemy? But the enemy had brought food. Even now, in Texas, with a plate of ribs still warm in her belly, she could hear the ghosts of those warnings. It made her sick to think of what they had feared, and sicker still to admit that none of it had happened. At least not yet. She sat on her bunk that night, staring at the wooden ceiling of the barracks. The desert wind rattled the shutters. The smell of smoke still clung to her fingers. And she couldn't stop remembering that boy on the island, the one who died whispering the Emperor's name, the one who would never know that in the heart of America. In a place called Ruston, she had been fed with both hands. What did it mean to live after surrender? What did it mean to taste kindness from the mouth of the enemy? She didn't have the answers, only memories, and a belly full of ribs. She had never imagined that captivity could come with routine, and yet, as the sun rose over the Texas hills the next morning, the call to begin the day came not with barking commands or clanging metal, but with the low ring of a farm bell and the smell of brewed coffee wafting through warm air. There were no prison walls, no guards stomping boots against concrete, just men in dusty hats and denim shirts, already stacking hay or fixing fences, moving with the slow rhythm of people who had done this their whole lives. A cowboy strolled past the barracks, whistling, a broom tossed casually over one shoulder. He stopped near the steps and called out, "Mornin'! Chores if you all want 'em." The women glanced at each other. Some stayed seated, arms crossed in quiet defiance, but others stood, slowly, cautiously, not out of obedience, but out of something else. Curiosity, maybe. A few followed him toward a shed filled with supplies. By mid-morning, the strange rhythm of this place had begun to seep into their bones. One woman helped scrub the floors of the mess hall, her rag moving in slow, circular motions. Another hauled water from a nearby pump, her hands red and raw, but steady. There was no punishment for refusing work, no rewards for doing it either. The cowboys simply offered the tools, gave a nod, and moved on. She found herself in the kitchen watching one of the Americans, his name was Roy, she'd overheard, chop onions with a dull knife. He whistled through his teeth as he worked, the tune cheerful and strange. When she stepped closer, he paused, glanced at her, then motioned to the cutting board. "You want to try?" She didn't understand the words, but the gesture was clear. He handed her the knife. She hesitated, half expecting a trick, some sudden reversal, but nothing happened, so she chopped, slowly, roughly. But Roy just nodded, grinned, and kept whistling. It wasn't just that they were allowed to move freely. It was that they were being taught, not interrogated, not punished. Taught. Another cowboy showed one woman how to stack hay without straining her back. A third taught two nurses how to clean boots with oil instead of soap. And one afternoon, as the sun bent low across the hills, a small group gathered under a tree while an older man, gray at the temples, demonstrated how to build a fire using only flint and dry grass. She sat nearby, watching. The man struck the flint once, twice, until sparks caught. The dry grass flared. The fire came alive. He leaned back on his heels, wiped his hands on his jeans, and said something she couldn't understand, but it sounded like pride. And then something stranger happened. The laughter began. Not loud, not bold, but small, like a breeze in tall grass. A few women chuckled as they fumbled with firewood. One teased another for burning the bread in the kitchen. A cowboy responded with a joke of his own, something about too much salt and not enough sense. And the sound of it, his accent, his lightness, landed like a foreign language spoken in music. She didn't know what to do with that sound. Laughter was something from another life, a pre-war thing, a peacetime indulgence. But now it lived here, beside labor, beside smoke, beside men who wore boots instead of uniforms and spoke like the world hadn't fallen apart. No one yelled, no one demanded. It was not freedom. But it was something close to it, dressed in the clothes of captivity. She sat on the edge of her cot that night, calluses forming on her palms, clothes speckled with flour and ash. Her stomach ached from work, not from hunger. The silence of the ranch stretched around her, warm and wide, and for the first time she feared not punishment, but comfort. Because this was not how the enemy was supposed to act. And this was not how prisoners were supposed to feel. The broom moved in slow, even strokes as one of the women swept the porch under the rising sun. Dust lifted with each pass, catching the morning light like mist. She'd done this every day now, always in silence, always with her eyes down. But today, something stopped her. Her hand froze on the broom handle, and her chest rose in one sharp inhale. Then it came. Tears, not from pain, not from fear, but from the sudden realization that she no longer needed to be afraid. She wept quietly, shoulders trembling, and when another woman stepped forward to help, she could only whisper, "I'm not afraid any more. I don't know when that happened." That simple truth, spoken aloud, felt heavier than any chain. Across the camp, others began to feel the same unease. Not because they were mistreated, but because they weren't. No one shouted at them. No one beat them. When they made mistakes, burned bread, spilled water, dropped tools, no punishment came. The silence, once feared, became suffocating. They had prepared for violence, braced for cruelty, but this calm kindness left them defenseless in a way nothing else could. Some still waited, tensing at every approach, expecting the American mask to slip. But it never did. Days passed, and still no guards barked commands. No shame was forced on them. There were chores, yes, but no threats, no lashings, no humiliation. At night, lying beneath thin wool blankets, the women whispered in the dark. One of them confessed she felt guilt now, not for losing the war, but for feeling safe. "What does it mean," she asked, "if they treat us better than our own commanders did?" Another responded, voice brittle, "Maybe they don't know who we are." But deep down, they knew that wasn't true. The Cowboys, these American jailers in denim and dust, had seen the uniforms. They had read the tags. They knew what Japan had done in the Pacific. And yet, they cooked meals. They passed tools into hands without hesitation. They asked about their names, even tried to pronounce them. Every day chipped away at the walls they had built inside themselves. What had once seemed unbreakable, ideology, hatred, pride, now cracked under the weight of too much dignity. Each small kindness became a question they could not escape. If the enemy treats us like people, then who were the liars? The American guards? Or the ones who trained us, marched us, told us death was preferable to defeat? One afternoon, a woman folded laundry beside a cowboy named Tom. He said little, worked steadily, humming as he went. When she dropped a sheet, he picked it up for her without comment, just a nod, just a small gesture. But her hands trembled as she took it from him. She didn't thank him, couldn't. But that moment haunted her through the night, not because he had helped her, but because he had expected nothing in return. By the end of the week, Their silence had changed. No longer the silence of fear, but the silence of doubt. The quiet in the mess hall after dinner, the stillness before sleep, all filled with questions they didn't yet know how to ask. Their pasts still clung to them like ash, but their present offered something unbearable, the possibility that kindness could undo everything. And that thought, that dangerous, quiet thought, was harder to survive than any battlefield. By the third week, the smoke had stopped meaning danger. It meant dinner. It meant safety. Each time it curled into the sky from the pit behind the mess hall, it told them that the day had passed without punishment, that no boots had kicked indoors, that no fists had struck. It was a strange new kind of signal, one that drifted in on the Texas wind and made their stomachs tighten with hunger and confusion. The scent of slow-roasted pork mingled with grilled onions, tangy sauce, and something sweet. Molasses or brown sugar, they weren't sure. But every time it rose, it brought something else with it too. Memory. The smell reminded them of festivals that had vanished with the war, of food they'd forgotten existed. One woman swore she'd dreamed of her mother cooking sweet potatoes over a coal fire back in Nagano. Another sat alone, cradling her plate, tears on her cheeks as she remembered the last meal she ate with her brother, 2 years before, under a tarp, in a village that no longer existed. It wasn't the food itself that hurt them. It was what it unlocked. And then one evening, it got stranger. The sun had dipped below the ridge, painting the sky in ribbons of orange and pink. A group of cowboys had lingered after dinner, laughing softly, someone tossing horseshoes against a wooden post. A fire crackled in the pit, and then, without announcement or performance, one of them pulled a guitar from its case. He sat on the porch steps and began to play. The sound was unfamiliar, twangy, low, warm, but it wasn't loud. It moved slowly, like the smoke, like the heat, like everything else in this place. The melody was simple. No words. Just strings and silence between the notes. The women froze at first. The last time they'd heard music had been during a military ceremony in Tokyo, a shrill, martial rhythm that spoke of duty and death. This was different. This was soft. One woman closed her eyes, another touched the edge of the bench as if to ground herself. And then, to her own surprise, one of the nurses began to hum. It wasn't intentional, it just happened. The sound slipped from her lips like breath. A soft echo of the tune, nothing more. The cowboy didn't stop. He just nodded, barely, and kept playing. And then another joined, humming too. Someone shyly added a few Japanese words, half of a lullaby from childhood. No one laughed. No one told them to be quiet. For a moment, they weren't prisoners. They were voices under stars. That night, something changed. In the quiet afterward, after the fire had turned to embers and the guitar had gone still, the women didn't go straight to bed. A few lingered, sitting on the steps. They didn't speak much, but their silence was different now, lighter. One woman even laughed, brief, breathy, awkward. She clamped her hand over her mouth like she had broken something. But when the cowboy glanced her way, he just smiled. The laughter returned slowly in the days that followed. It wasn't loud. It came in shy bursts, in the kitchen when someone oversalted the beans, at the washing line when a shirt blew away, during lessons in fire starting when a woman nearly singed her eyebrows and cursed in Japanese, and each time it came, it startled them, because laughter had once been treason, but now it was a sign that something buried inside them was still alive. Not joy, exactly, but the muscle memory of it, a sound they hadn't made since before the war, before the uniforms, before the lies. It wasn't healing, not yet, but it was breath, and breath meant life. And life, for now, meant smoke, food, and music that carried into the Texas night like a language no one had taught them. But they were beginning to remember. When the paper came, it arrived without warning. A guard, one of the cowboys now assigned to supply duty, carried a small box under his arm, its contents as ordinary as they were dangerous. Inside were pencils, envelopes, and thin white sheets of stationery stamped with the Red Cross emblem. He placed it on the table in the mess hall and said, almost apologetically, "You can write home." Then he tipped his hat and left. No speech, no orders, just an invitation. The women stared as if he'd set a weapon there instead. Home. The word no longer sounded real. They gathered slowly, as if drawn by instinct rather than permission. Some touched the paper first, running fingers over the smooth surface. For months, their hands had known only tools, laundry, or soil. Writing, putting their voices back into words, felt like a dangerous freedom. The nurse who had once swept the porch until her palms blistered now sat at the corner table. The pencil was light in her hand, almost too light to be real. She looked at the blank page for a long time, the white of it nearly blinding in the late afternoon sun. Finally she wrote, "I don't know how to tell you this. They gave us meat." The words looked foreign, unbelievable. Her breath caught. She wrote again, slower this time. "They gave us food, real food, and they treat us kindly." Then she stopped, ashamed. The image of her mother came unbidden, a woman crouched by a stove that no longer worked, boiling weeds, rationing rice grains between her daughters. How could she write this truth to a world still starving? Her own stomach turned at the thought. Around her, others were wrestling with the same impossible confession. One woman wrote, "I am alive," over and over, unable to say anything else. Another wrote of the fields, of the horses, of the smell of smoke. One whispered, "If I tell them what it's like, they'll think I've betrayed them." No one answered. The air inside the mess hall thickened with guilt, the sound of pencil scratching paper like small cries. The nurse tried again. "The Americans are not what we were told. They give us blankets, coffee, and something called cornbread. We are clean, we are fed. I do not understand it. I do not know what to feel." She paused. Outside, she could hear the faint sound of laughter, men talking near the stables, someone strumming a few lazy chords on a guitar. It was strange to hear joy drift through barbed wire. Stranger still to realize she wasn't afraid of it anymore. She folded the letter once, then hesitated. The sleeve of her uniform brushed against the page, leaving a faint orange stain of barbecue sauce. She stared at it for a long time. That small mark said everything her words could not. She almost crumpled the paper, almost tore it to pieces, but something inside her resisted. The letter was truth, even if truth now tasted like shame. When the collection came, an American corporal who spoke broken Japanese walked down the line of tables. He smiled awkwardly, murmuring arigato as he gathered the envelopes. The women handed them over in silence. They knew these letters would be read before they ever crossed the ocean. The cowboys called it censorship. To them, it was something far more intimate, exposure. Their hearts, unwrapped and inspected by men they barely knew. That night, the nurse lay awake on her bunk, staring at the ceiling. Outside, the Texas wind moved through the fences, soft as breath. Somewhere beyond that wire, her letter was being opened, read, translated, sealed again. She imagined the censor's face, a stranger's eyes tracing her words, pausing on the line about the meat, about kindness. Would he laugh? Would he understand? She turned over and buried her face in her pillow, her eyes burning. The guilt was worse than hunger now, because to survive, she was learning, was not the hardest thing. It was to live well in a world that had starved without her. Because to survive, she was learning, was not the hardest thing. It was to live well in a world that had starved without her. The next morning unfolded slowly, wrapped in the soft hum of the Texas dawn. There was no shouting, no clatter of boots against concrete, only the lazy rhythm of the ranch as it stretched awake. The air smelled faintly of hay and smoke. The nurse sat alone outside the barracks, peeling potatoes into a tin bucket. The work was quiet, almost meditative, the kind of labor that kept the hands busy and the mind still. She didn't notice the cowboy until his shadow fell over her. He was the tall one, the one who always spoke with the calm drawl that made every sentence sound like a story. His hat tilted low against the rising sun. He leaned casually against the post and watched her for a moment without saying anything. "You're good at that," he said finally. She didn't answer. Her English could carry her through the simplest exchanges. Yes, no, thank you. But this wasn't one of them. Instead, she nodded slightly and kept peeling. The knife scraped against the skin of the potato, steady and rhythmic. Then he spoke again, this time quieter, the words landing with the weight of something that had been waiting to be said. "My brother was on the Arizona, December 7th. Her hands stopped. The potato slipped from her fingers and fell into the dust. She didn't reach for it. She didn't breathe. The name, Pearl Harbor, hung between them like smoke, thick and inescapable. Back home, she'd heard it spoken with pride, the kind of word meant to ignite cheers in parade squares and inspire young men to die for the emperor. But here, on this porch in America, it was different. It was not triumph. It was a wound. The cowboy's gaze stayed on the horizon, his face unreadable. "Never made it out," he said simply. No anger, no accusation, just loss, spoken plain. When he finally looked at her, she braced herself for hatred, for the venom she believed must be there. But there was none. "That don't mean I hate you," he said after a pause. "Just means I know what it costs." The words struck her deeper than any insult could have. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the buzz of the cicadas and the faint creak of wood beneath their feet. She wanted to respond, to explain that her brother had died too, somewhere in the Pacific, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she met his eyes and saw not an enemy, but a man who carried grief as quietly as she did. When she finally managed to speak, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Why?" she asked. He understood anyway. "Because you're here," he said softly. "And over here we do things different. Doesn't bring my brother back, but it doesn't bury yours either." That night she couldn't stop thinking about him, the way he'd said it, not like forgiveness, but like truth, a truth heavy enough to crack something inside her. She lay awake long after lights out, listening to the faint clinking of dishes from the mess hall, the murmur of cowboys laughing softly under the stars. It occurred to her then that every man here had lost someone, that maybe the laughter wasn't defiance, it was survival. In the days that followed, she saw him often, sometimes near the stables, sometimes by the fire pit, always moving with a kind of unhurried sadness. He never spoke of the war again, but his silence said enough. He still handed her food when it was her turn in the line. He still nodded when their eyes met. Each gesture carried the same unspoken message. We are both still here. And that realization began to change her. For the first time, she wondered whether strength could live in compassion rather than cruelty, whether dignity could exist without victory. The world had told her that mercy was weakness, that the enemy was less than human, but the man who had every reason to hate her had done the opposite. He'd shared his fire. That night, as she washed her hands in a basin of cold water, she looked at her reflection and barely recognized herself. The woman who had once sworn to die for honor was learning, quietly and painfully, that honor could look very different under another man's sky. The news came like wind through dry grass, whisper first, then murmur, then the uneasy silence that always follows disbelief. The war was over, not ending, over. It spread through the camp like smoke that couldn't be contained. Men stopped mid-task, women dropped their brooms, and for a long, breathless minute, no one moved. Some of the cowboys already knew, of course. They had radios. They'd heard it days ago, but no one had told the prisoners until the orders arrived. The Japanese were going home. Repatriation, they called it. Such a neat word for something so heavy. The nurse sat on her bunk with her hands folded in her lap. She should have felt joy, she told herself. Relief, at the very least. But her heart moved differently, slower, heavier. Home. That word no longer fit right in her mouth. The women around her began to pack, folding what few things they had: a blanket that smelled faintly of smoke, a shirt mended by an American seamstress, a handkerchief given in kindness. One girl, barely 20, tucked a dried flower between the pages of her Bible. Another folded a pair of work gloves into her bag like they were gold. The barracks filled with quiet motion. No one sang, no one cheered. There was too much confusion for celebration. They had arrived here broken, terrified of cruelty that never came. Now, after months of decency, of routine, of slow healing, they were being returned to a country in ruins, to hunger, to judgment, to questions they weren't ready to answer. The nurse found herself sitting at the edge of her bed, staring at the small pile of things she'd collected. A button from a uniform, a scrap of cloth she'd used to dry her hands by the fire, a small square of paper on which she'd practiced English words. Thank you, sorry, alive. She picked them up one by one, then set them down again. She wasn't sure what she was allowed to take or what she wanted to keep. Every object carried the weight of contradiction. To bring them home would mean remembering, and remembering might look like betrayal. That night, the conversation turned to fear. One woman whispered, "What will they call us?" Another answered, "Survivors." But her voice lacked conviction. Someone else muttered, "Traitors." The word hung in the air like a knife. Because deep down they all knew how stories were told in Japan, how surrender was not survival but disgrace, how mercy from the enemy would never be seen as mercy, only as weakness. "They'll think we were fed to forget," one said, "that we were made soft." The nurse thought of her mother's hands, calloused from work, trembling as she accepted rationed rice from the neighbors. She thought of the children begging in the rubble of Tokyo. She thought of the cowboy, his brother dead at Pearl Harbor, offering her a plate anyway. What could she possibly say to anyone back home that would make sense of it? That the enemy's bread had tasted of smoke and guilt and kindness? That she had found, among those she was raised to hate, the first human warmth since the war began? In the morning, she stepped outside and found one of the younger women crouched by the trash pit behind the kitchen. Her hands shook as she dropped something into the dirt. The nurse looked closer. It was cornbread. A small, square piece, still wrapped in napkin paper. The girl whispered, "I can't take it with me." Then she covered it with sand. The nurse watched, unable to speak. She understood. The bread was more than food, it was memory. It was proof. Proof that kindness had existed in captivity. Proof that the stories they had believed were wrong. proof that humanity, once seen, could not be unseen. But when she turned away, she caught the scent of smoke from the pit where the Americans were cooking one last meal. It rose into the morning sky, slow and blue, curling through the sunlight. She closed her eyes, willing herself to forget that smell, to bury it like the cornbread. But she couldn't. No matter how far she would travel, no matter how many oceans separated her from this land, she knew the truth would travel with her. The smoke, the food, the music, the mercy, everything she had tasted here would follow her home. The ship's horn moaned through a fog so thick it felt alive. Japan emerged from it slowly, gray and skeletal, like something rising unwillingly from the sea. The women stood on the deck, clutching small bundles, eyes hollowed by months of uncertainty. When the harbor came into view, no one spoke. The cranes were rusted, the docks cracked, and the smell of rot and salt water hung in the air. The nurse looked down at her reflection, trembling in the water below, and almost didn't recognize it. The roundness in her cheeks, the faint color in her skin. She looked alive, and that alone made her ashamed. As they disembarked, the silence was heavier than any shout. No flowers, no embraces, no flags. The crowd that waited was thin and tired, faces drawn from hunger. Some looked away, others stared too long. When one old man spat on the ground, it wasn't in anger, it was exhaustion. The nurse followed the others through the ruined port, her shoes crunching over glass. The air tasted of ash and metal, not the clean, dry wind of Texas. And as strange as it was to admit, she missed it. The smell of barbecue smoke rising with the dusk, the crackle of fire, the easy laughter of men who had once been her captors. The journey home through the city was like walking through a memory that had burned out. Wooden houses flattened to splinters, streets lined with stone chimneys that led nowhere. She passed a row of children scavenging for scraps in the rubble. One boy looked up at her, his face caked in soot, and she saw a reflection of the people she thought she was returning to save. When she reached what was left of her neighborhood, only the foundations remained. Her mother was alive. Thinner than she'd imagined, her back bent, her eyes too large for her face. They embraced, but it was brief. Her mother's ribs were sharp, her breath shallow. "You look strong," she said, voice almost proud. "They must not have treated you poorly." The nurse could not answer. That night she sat beside the small charcoal brazier her mother used for cooking. The rice was watery, the pickled radish bitter. She ate slowly, feeling every grain like an accusation. For the first time in months, her hands shook again. She could still feel the warmth of the Texas sun on her skin, the weight of a tin tray heavy with food, the sweet sting of smoked pork. She wanted to tell her mother about the Cowboys, about how one had handed her a napkin and said, "Hope y'all are hungry," but the words stayed trapped behind her teeth. To say it out loud would sound like betrayal. Days turned into weeks. The women from the camp scattered, each retreating into her own silence. Some married, some vanished. When rumors spread that repatriated POWs were being shunned, she stopped going outside. The war might have ended, but something inside her hadn't. She lived now between two worlds, one built from hunger, one from kindness, and she belonged fully to neither. One afternoon, while cleaning her satchel, she found the letter she had never sent. The paper was yellowed, the pencil faded but legible. "They fed me with both hands, and I am still alive." She stared at the line for a long time, then pressed it to her chest. The world around her had starved, yet she had eaten, and from that meal a piece of her soul had changed forever. As dusk fell, she stepped outside. The sky was streaked with red. Somewhere nearby, a neighbor's cooking fire sent a thin ribbon of smoke curling upward. She closed her eyes, and for a fleeting moment, she was back there, on a wide plain under an American sun, a cowboy's laughter echoing in the distance, the scent of charred ribs and cornbread in the air. It wasn't a dream, but a memory that had learned how to haunt gently. She sat on the wooden steps until the last light faded, the letter folded neatly in her lap. Around her, Japan was quiet, hungry, rebuilding itself from the bones of the past. Inside her, something else was rebuilding too, not loyalty, not pride, but a fragile understanding that humanity had no sides. And as the night wind carried the smell of distant smoke across the ruins, she whispered into the dark, "They fed me with both hands, and I am still alive." As this story closes, we want to hear from you. Where in the world are you watching from? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read everyone. If this story moved you, helped you see history in a new light, or made you feel something real, we'd be honored if you gave it a like. And don't forget to subscribe. The button's right below this video. Just give it a click, and if you tap the bell icon next to it, you'll never miss a story like this again. With your support, we can keep uncovering the human truths hidden inside the darkest chapters of history. Stories that remind us that even behind enemy lines, dignity, kindness, and smoke rising from a barbecue pit can change everything.